The air in the sanctum was a low, electric hum, a symphony of cooling fans and the quiet murmur of 100 supercomputers processing the fate of nations. It was a sterile cathedral of technology, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow above a vast, circular room. Tiered platforms held rows of analysts, their faces illuminated by the eerie blue and green glow of holographic displays and tactical maps. In the center of this digital ocean stood a single obsidian table, a polished black mirror reflecting the worried faces of the Joint Chiefs. This was the nerve center of global defense, a place so secure that its own existence was a state secret. And within its walls, a ghost was methodically dismantling its defenses. Elara Vance pushed her janitorial cart along the polished concrete perimeter, the squeak of a recalcitrant wheel the only sound that didn't belong. To the dozens of focused, high-strung officers and analysts, she was less than a ghost, she was furniture. A woman in a drab gray jumpsuit, her hair tucked under a simple cap, her face a neutral mask of weary competence. They saw the mop, the bucket, the slow, methodical circles she wiped on a glass partition, and their brains simply edited her out of the picture. She was a function, not a person. And that was precisely how she had survived for the last 20 years. Anonymity was a fortress more secure than any concrete bunker. Inside, she observed, she listened, she remembered. She saw the creeping arrogance in the younger generation of cyber warfare specialists, their absolute faith in algorithms, and their disdain for the analog instincts of their elders. She saw the political maneuvering, the petty rivalries that festered even here, at the supposed pinnacle of selfless service. And she saw General Marcus Thorne, a man she hadn't seen in person since the Berlin Wall was more than just a memory, grow older, wearier, his shoulders stooped by a weight no one else in this room could possibly comprehend. The tension today was different. It was a cold, sharp-edged thing that cut through the usual hum of controlled chaos. A critical security breach, they called it. But Elara knew from the frantic, whispered conversations it was more. It was an impossibility. A phantom protocol, codenamed Cerberus, had been activated from within their own system. It wasn't a hack, it was a coup. Their global drone fleet, their satellite surveillance network, their automated defense platforms, all were being systematically firewalled, locked away from their own commanders by a digital ghost that used their own security measures against them. The system wasn't broken, it was obeying a higher, unknown authority. Colonel Rex Thorne, a man whose ambition was as polished and sharp as the eagles on his collar, paced behind the general. "It's a quantum encryption worm, sir. State of the art. Something we haven't seen before. My people are trying to brute force a decryption key, but it's adapting faster than we can analyze it." His voice was a blend of feigned deference and naked condescension, a tone reserved for a legendary but, in his view, obsolete superior. Elara paused her wiping, her hands stilling on the glass. She watched the general's reflection. He wasn't looking at the frantic data streams on the main screen. He was looking past them, into a memory. A place of dust and shadows, of whispered codes and impossible choices. He knew what this was. And a cold dread, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 2 decades, began to seep into the comfortable numbness of her quiet life. The fortress of anonymity was about to be tested. "Brute force is a fool's errand, Colonel." General Thorne's voice was gravelly, scraped raw by hours of fruitless deliberation. "You're trying to pick a lock when the house is burning down around you." He turned away from the holographic map, which now showed a cascade of friendly assets turning from green to a terrifying, inert gray. The silence in the sanctum deepened. The clatter of keyboards ceased. Every eye was on the old man. The young analysts, masters of a digital universe, looked on with a mixture of pity and impatience. They saw a relic, a dinosaur from an age of vacuum tubes and punch cards, completely out of his depth. They couldn't see the gears turning behind his tired eyes, the desperate search through a mental archive of last-ditch contingency plans, of protocols so secret they were never written down, passed only by voice and memory in smoke-filled rooms long since demolished. "This isn't a new weapon," the general murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's an old key. A key to a door we were never meant to open again." Colonel Thorne stepped forward, his posture radiating smug certainty. Sir, with all due respect, my team represents the pinnacle of modern cryptographic science. If there was a key, we would have found it. This is an external attack by a hostile state-level actor. The general's gaze swept across the room, over the sea of bright, confident, and utterly lost faces. He saw his best and brightest, and they were all useless. They were trying to solve a spiritual problem with a calculator. This wasn't about code, it was about a covenant. A promise made in a different world by different people. A failsafe designed by a mind that didn't think in ones and zeros, but in sacrifice and consequence. A mind that had been declared dead for 20 years. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, passed over the cleaning lady by the far wall, a flicker of annoyance at the distraction, before moving on. She was just part of the scenery. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his energy, General Thorne straightened his back. A subtle transformation occurred. The weary old man vanished, replaced by the commander who had held the line at Checkpoint Charlie, the strategist who had outthought men who now only existed as footnotes in classified histories. His face became an impassive mask. He was no longer speaking to the room, but to someone he prayed was still listening, somewhere in the world, somewhere in the static. He closed his eyes for a brief second, a silent prayer for a miracle. Then he began. It was not a speech. It was not an order. It was a sequence, a silent language known only to the dead and one other. First, his right hand rose, not in a salute, but to gently tap his index finger against his right temple, twice. A pause, precisely one heartbeat long. Then, his weight shifted, a barely perceptible movement, onto the ball of his left foot, his heel lifting a fraction of an inch from the floor. He held it. Another heartbeat. Finally, his eyes, which had been staring into the middle distance, performed a slow, deliberate blink, first the right eye, then the left, the interval between them exactly the time it takes to draw a sharp, silent breath. He held the gaze, his face a granite cliff, waiting for a response that could not possibly come. The performance was complete. The room was utterly still, the silence now thick with confusion and a creeping sense of embarrassment for the old general. The shepherd had sent his call into the void. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. It was broken by a quiet, contemptuous sound. A scoff. Colonel Rex Thorne shook his head, a small, pitying smile playing on his lips. "General," he said, his voice laced with the kind of strained patience one uses for a confused grandparent. "Perhaps it's time we let the active team handle this. We're burning daylight with theatrics." The word hung in the air, dripping with disrespect. Several of the younger analysts exchanged knowing glances. They saw it as confirmation of their deepest beliefs. The old guard was senile, clinging to dusty rituals while the real war was being fought in cyberspace, a realm they no longer understood. The general's display was, to them, the sad, last spasm of a forgotten era. One lieutenant, emboldened by the colonel's open mockery, whispered to his neighbor, "What was that? Some kind of secret handshake from the Cold War?" The neighbor snickered quietly. "Probably the command to launch the cavalry." The entire command structure, from the eager lieutenants to the ambitious colonel, was united in a moment of shared, dismissive pity. They were witnessing the emotional breakdown of a legend, a great man finally succumbing to the pressures of a world that had moved on without him. The general's face, already pale, seemed to shrink. He had played his last card, a desperate, impossible gamble, and it had failed. He had called out to a ghost, and only the mocking silence had answered. The gray tide on the main screen continued to spread, a digital plague consuming their most vital assets. Hope, for the first time, began to truly die in the heart of the sanctum. And then a sound. Or rather, the cessation of one. The rhythmic, almost subliminal squeak of the janitor's cart stopped. The quiet, swishing sound of a mop on the floor ceased. In a room governed by the hum of machines, the sudden absence of this small, human noise was as jarring as a gunshot. Every head, one by one, turned toward the source of the non-sound. Elara Vance stood frozen by the far wall, her back to the central command table. Her gloved hand rested on the handle of her cart. For a long moment she did not move. Her internal world was a firestorm. For 20 years she had cultivated peace. She had traded a life of shadows and adrenaline for quiet obscurity, for the simple, honest labor of her hands. She had earned this silence. It was her reward for all she had lost, for all the names on the memorial wall that only she could read. To answer the call would be to surrender that peace forever. The shepherd calls. Does the lamb answer? But she knew, even as the question formed, that she was never the lamb. She was the wolf who guarded the flock, the one who walked in darkness so others could live in the light. The promise she had made was not bound by time or circumstance. It was a covenant, etched onto her soul. With a slow, deliberate grace that seemed utterly alien to her drab uniform, she placed her spray bottle back into its holster on the cart. She peeled off her thick rubber gloves, one finger at a time, and dropped them into the waste receptacle. Then she turned. She didn't look at the astonished faces of the analysts. She didn't spare a glance for the smug, confused expression on Colonel Thorne's face. Her eyes, clear and startlingly sharp, found General Thorne's across the cavernous room. They were the eyes of a hawk, ancient and knowing, and they cut through the years, through the layers of rank and time and tragedy. They locked onto his, a connection re-established across a 20-year chasm of silence. The general's breath hitched in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He watched as her head gave a single, near imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of simple agreement. It was a mirror. A perfect, flawless execution of the final motion in the code he had just transmitted, the slow, deliberate blink, a right eye, left eye confirmation. It was more than a reply, it was a countersign. An affirmation of identity and readiness that was so deeply classified it was officially listed as myth. A wave of vertigo washed over General Thorne. The blood drained from his face, leaving it the color of ash. The room, the crisis, the mocking subordinates, they all melted away. He was no longer in the sanctum. He was in a damp, cold cellar in East Berlin, whispering a final contingency plan to a young woman with eyes that held the wisdom of ages, the only operative he ever met who he knew, with absolute certainty, was better than him. The architect of the very system that now held them hostage. Her code name echoed in his mind, a name spoken only in whispers, a name that had become a legend, then a ghost story. Wraith. The cleaning lady had just answered the call. And the general understood, with a terror that was swiftly being replaced by a dawning, terrible hope, that the ghost had come home. The shock on General Thorne's face was a tectonic event, a complete realignment of his reality. His jaw went slack. For a full 3 seconds, he was incapable of speech. The room held its breath, watching the silent, incomprehensible drama unfold between the 4-star general and the janitor. Colonel Thorne, seeing only a doddering old man staring blankly at a menial worker, took a step forward. "Sir, if you're not well," he began, his voice oozing false concern. The general's arm shot out, a gesture of shocking speed and authority. "Silence!" he roared, and the word cracked through the sanctum like a whip. Every person in the room flinched. The voice was not that of a weary old man. It was the voice of absolute command, a voice that had sent men into battle and held nations in check. His eyes, burning with a new and terrifying fire, were still locked on Alara. Then he tore his gaze away, sweeping it across the assembled staff. "Everybody out!" he commanded. "Clear the floor. Now!" Confusion morphed into stunned disbelief. "Sir?" Colonel Thorne stammered. "We are in the middle of a level 10 crisis. We can't just, Colonel, you will take every man and woman on this floor to the auxiliary briefing room and you will await my orders." The general snapped, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "That is a direct command. Your sidearm, Colonel." On the table. The order was so bizarre, so outside the bounds of protocol, that Rex Thorne could only stare, his mouth agape. Disarm him? In favor of a cleaning lady? But the look in the general's eyes was not one of madness. It was one of chilling, absolute certainty. With trembling fingers, Colonel Thorne unholstered his pistol and placed it on the obsidian table. "Out," the general repeated, softer this time, but with an edge of pure steel. Silently, the most brilliant military minds of a generation filed out of the room, casting bewildered, resentful glances over their shoulders at the old man and the cleaning woman who stood, serene and silent, in the center of the storm. The heavy vault door hissed shut, sealing the two of them alone in the heart of the dying machine. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic, rhythmic beeping of a system alert, a digital heartbeat counting down to catastrophe. General Thorne slowly walked toward Elara, his steps unsteady, as if crossing treacherous ground. He stopped a few feet from her, his face a canvas of awe, grief, and disbelief. "Vance?" he whispered, the name tasting alien on his tongue after so many years. "Elara Vance? They told me you were gone." Kia in the Riga operation. Elara offered a small, sad smile. It was the first time an expression had truly touched her face, and it was like watching a statue come to life. "It was better that way, Marcus," she said, her voice quiet but clear, and used to holding authority. "The dead can't be questioned. They can't be hunted. I needed peace." "Peace?" He gestured around the room, at the failing systems and the impending global disaster. "And you chose to find it here?" "The best place to hide is the one place no one would ever look," she replied simply. "I kept my oath. I watched. I listened. I stayed ready." There was no accusation in her voice, only a statement of fact. She had upheld her end of the covenant, even in exile. The general ran a hand over his face, the years seeming to fall away as the reality of her presence sank in. "The Cerberus key," he said, his voice urgent, professional. "It's yours. Your design. We thought it was a defensive protocol, a last resort firewall to protect the network from outside intrusion. It is," Elara confirmed, her eyes already scanning the cascading lines of code on the main display, her mind processing the data at a speed no one else in the building could match. "But its primary function is offensive. It's not designed to keep an enemy out. It's designed to lock its masters in. To quarantine the system if the command structure itself is ever compromised." The general stared at her, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Compromised? By who?" Elara's gaze was direct. "By someone with level 1 clearance, Marcus. Someone in this room." Cerberus wasn't activated by an enemy. It was a silent coup, triggered from the inside. The general led her to the central command console, the one abandoned by a cocky analyst only moments before. He gestured for her to sit. The act of a 4-star general pulling out a chair for a janitor would have been unthinkable, but in that moment, it was the most natural thing in the world. Elara sat, and for the first time, her hands touched a keyboard. In the auxiliary briefing room, the mood was mutinous. The analysts and officers watched on a monitor that showed a single, silent feed of the sanctum's main floor. They saw the woman in the gray jumpsuit sit down at the command chair. Colonel Thorne was livid, pacing like a caged tiger. "He's lost his mind," Thorne seethed. "Decades of service, down the drain. He's cracked under the pressure, and he's going to let some deluded cleaning woman destroy what's left of our defense network." A young lieutenant, the same one who had mocked the general's code, zoomed the camera in on the console. "What's she even doing?" "Her hands are just hovering over the keyboard." But they weren't just hovering. From the general's perspective, standing beside her, it was something else entirely. Elara's fingers danced over the keys, but she rarely pressed them. She was tracing patterns, her touch so light it was like a ghost's. She wasn't logging in, she was communing with the machine. "They see the system as a fortress to be defended," she murmured, her eyes distant. "I designed it as a living thing. It has a heartbeat. A memory. The traitor used the command key, but they don't know the language. They gave it an order. I'm going to have a conversation with it." With that, her hands descended. It was not typing. It was a blur of motion, a symphony of commands and subroutines entered with a speed and precision that defied belief. She wasn't fighting the Cerberus protocol, she was seducing it. She bypassed entire layers of security not by breaking them, but by using archaic administrative backdoors she herself had woven into the code 20 years ago, digital cobwebs no modern scanner would ever think to look for. The system, which had been a hostile, locked fortress, began to respond to her touch. On the main screen, a single green line of code appeared in the sea of red alerts. It was a response. The machine was talking back. The watchers in the auxiliary room fell silent. On the screen they saw it. A cascade of green. Entire blocks of firewalled systems began unlocking. Drone feeds flickered back to life. Satellite uplinks re-established their connections. The gray tide of death on the holographic map was receding, beaten back by a wave of vibrant, healthy green. It was happening too fast for them to comprehend. Decryption processes that their supercomputers had estimated would take months were being completed in seconds. The colonel stopped his pacing, his face a mask of stunned, horrified disbelief. "How?" he whispered. "That's impossible." In the sanctum, Ilara's work reached its crescendo. A final, complex query appeared on her screen. It was the system's heart, the core of the Cerberus protocol, asking for the ultimate passcode, the master key that could command or destroy it. The failsafe of all failsafes. The general watched, his breath held tight in his chest. He knew this was the final test. Ilara leaned in, and with 10 keystrokes, she typed a single word, Echo 7 Zulu. It was the code name of her first partner, a young agent who had died in her arms in that Berlin cellar all those years ago. A name no one else on Earth knew. A ghost's password. The screen flashed once, a brilliant emerald green, and then every system returned to normal. The crisis was over. Ilara leaned back in the chair, a single, weary sigh escaping her lips. It was done. She pointed a finger at a small, flashing icon in the corner of the monitor. "There," she said, her voice tired but firm. "The origin point of the Cerberus activation. Terminal 4B. General Thorne's eyes widened. He turned slowly and looked through the glass partition into the auxiliary briefing room. He saw Colonel Rex Thorne standing there, his face ashen, beside the terminal designated 4B. The traitor had been unmasked not by an algorithm, but by a memory. The general placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder. "Welcome back, Director Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he turned to the intercom, his eyes boring into the disgraced colonel. "Colonel Thorne," his voice boomed through the speakers, cold and final. "You are under arrest for high treason. You dismissed the one person who could save us because you couldn't see past the uniform. This command has no place for blindness. And you have an appointment with a court-martial." In the sanctum, Ilara Vance, the ghost in the machine, simply closed her eyes. The quiet hum of a fully restored, fully operational command center the only sound in her world. Her peace was gone, but her purpose had returned. The legend was alive, and justice, after a long and patient slumber, was finally awake.